Okay, very good. So, everybody, welcome to today's presentation by Ed Bernbaum. Ed's a mountaineer and a scholar of comparative religion and mythology. And he wrote the book Sacred Mountains of the World, which has really become a classic. It's an award-winning book, which has just been published in the second edition, an expanded version of it by Cambridge University Press. Now, I have had the privilege of working with Ed for a number of years. He founded and directed the Sacred Mountains program at the Mountain Institute between the year 2000 and 2008. And in the past, he's been president of the Harvard Mountaineering Club and instructor at Colorado Outward Bound. And besides that, he's been featured in a really wonderful exhibit at the American Alpine Club Mountaineering Museum called Beyond the Mountaintops: Extraordinary Mountaineers, Extraordinary People, on 8 different climbers who have pioneered advances in climbing and humankind. I'd like to thank our host today from Earth and Environmental Sciences, History Department, Religion Department, and the South Asian Studies Program for giving us the opportunity to bring Ed to speak to us today. So without further ado, Ed, please take it away.
Oh, thanks. Thanks, Alton. It's great to be here, and thanks very much for the invitation to come to speak. And also, it's kind of a reunion of old folks from the Mountain Institute. Alton and I worked together for a number of years, and I'll be showing some projects which he was familiar with, and one of which he actually participated in. So why don't I switch over to share screen and go to, okay. All right. So my talk today is going to be on sacred mountains of the world. Almost all the pictures you'll see are ones I've taken, various parts of the world. Sometimes people will say, well, sacred mountains of the world, I don't think it's true for you people, but often people will say, well, it's an esoteric subject, sort of on the edges of things. And I say, quite the contrary. It's really takes you right into the heart of what's important to people, because one, mountains are sacred, and they're sacred in cultures all over the world. They become naturally associated with the highest and deepest and most central values and aspirations. So because of that, I found in looking at sacred mountains, it's also a wonderful way to do cross-cultural studies, because once you go into the subject, it takes you into the field of geography, religion, anthropology, philosophy, literature, art, goes on and on. What I'm going to show here is what I'd like maybe for you people to come away with is the incredible diversity of ways in which mountains are sacred and their different meanings and cultures all around the world. So I'd like to begin. Alton asked me to sort of give you a sense of how I got into this. My father was in the Foreign Service, and when I was 2 years old, we moved to Quito, Ecuador in the Andes. And my earliest memories are snow-capped peaks on the equator, like this one, Cotopaxi, which used to be considered the world's highest active volcano, a bit over 19,500 feet high. I returned to Ecuador when I was around 15, and I got intrigued with the idea of going up to snow on the equator. So somebody put me in touch with an Ecuadorian mountaineering club called Nuevos Horizontes, New Horizons, and I started climbing with Ecuadorians and went up into a realm of incredible beauty and enchantment. Wind-sculpted snow on a glacier here on a mountain called Antisana. This led to climbing in college. I went on an expedition to Mount St. Elias, the second highest peak in Alaska. And then after I graduated from college, drawn to the highest mountains in the world, I went with the Peace Corps to Nepal. While I was there, I went on an expedition to this mountain, which you see here, called Annapurna South. It's about 24,000 feet high, and it's part of a mountain range that's considered sacred, especially by Hindus. Now you notice the cloud coming down, that's an avalanche, and I was caught in an avalanche over here and swept about 1,000 feet down and buried. It was sort of a turning point in my life. And after that, I went out to the Everest area to see Everest, and wound up at a monastery called Tengboche, which some of you may have seen or been to. And this is a peak behind Tengboche, just under 20,000 feet high, called Machermari. I managed to climb it, and we thought it was the most difficult climb I've ever done. We thought it was the first ascent, and I had the pleasure of thinking so for 11 years until I ran into somebody who climbed it before us, but we climbed it by a new route. Now, I came back down to this monastery of Tengboche and wound up trekking back to Kathmandu with this is the summit of the mountain, which we reached. I trekked back to Kathmandu with the abbot or head lama of Tengboche monastery, whom you see here. And we walked for about 11 days. And on the way, he told me about a Tibetan myth of a hidden kingdom called Shambhala, after I joked with him about whether he'd ever heard of Shangri-La from Lost Horizon. Of course, he didn't know it. And sometimes you crack a joke, you do something, and it alters the course of your life, which it did for me, because I came back on a project to list and microfilm Tibetan texts, and eventually wrote a book about my first book, The Way to Shambhala, about Tibetan myths and legends of hidden sanctuaries. This is a picture of me with the Lama at Tengboche. He'd just given me this robe, which is a Tibetan nobleman's robe, and I was looking a lot younger than I look today. So anyway, in the course of doing this, I went back to graduate school and did a PhD. And one thing led to another, and I became interested in what mountains mean to people. And that led to writing Sacred Mountains of the World, which was first published in 1990. And the second edition is coming out, should be available in May. So let's get into the sacred. There are all sorts of ways of defining it and looking at it. I would say on a deep level, mountains as sacred places evoke an experience of something of deeper significance or reality that gives meaning and vitality to people's lives. Now, in the course of my research, looking around the world, what I found is that people experience that something of deeper significance through the views they have of mountains. And their incredible diversity of views of mountains. There are people who try to identify all sacred mountains, for example, with a sacred center. Mircea Eliade, a well-known scholar of history of religions, did that, but it really doesn't hold if you look at all the different ways in which mountains are sacred. So I found in the course of my research 10 very widespread themes, which we'll examine here. And through these themes, we'll look at a few particular sacred mountains in different regions of the world. So let's begin with the obvious theme, which is the mountain is the high place, height. And of course, the supreme example of that is Mount Everest, which you see here. A picture I took of Everest in alpenglow after sunset from the Tibetan side. Incidentally, you see a little dot next to the summit of the mountain. That's the planet Jupiter. And originally I wrote up a caption for this saying that Jupiter is Zeus, so that makes Everest, in a sense, the original Mount Olympus, where Zeus hangs out in Greek. However, the printer in Japan thought it was a glitch in the photograph and blacked it out, so it's not in the first edition. Then I did an exhibit on sacred mountains for the Smithsonian, and they called me and said, we think there's a glitch in the photograph, and I said, no, keep it in. So in the exhibit, it was there. So as the highest mountain in the world, Everest has acquired a kind of a semi-sacred status in the secular sense. And I should point out, we're going to be talking about sacred mountains and inspirational mountains. And mountains can be sacred even in a secular way if they represent something of ultimate meaning or value for you personally or for other people, whether it's religious or not in nature. Now, Everest is the highest mountain in the world. It acquired this sort of mythological status because Western society in particular puts a great value on whatever is number one, the biggest, the highest, and so forth, and people risk their lives. So here's a picture of a couple of climbers from the 1920s British Everest expedition. I think the higher climber is probably George Mallory, who disappeared on Everest and whose body was found just a few years ago. You notice there are 28,000 feet here, and you notice what they're wearing. It looks like they're out for a stroll in the Lake District in England. This is what people wear today, and you can see the difference. Back in the 1920s, they were really tough. So what about the name of the mountain? The Tibetan name of the mountain is Chomolungma, or more properly in Tibetan, Jomolangma. And it's almost always mistranslated in books as either Goddess Mother of the World or Goddess Mother of the Universe. This is because Westerners, outsiders, project their values onto the local indigenous Tibetans and Sherpas. Well, it turns out it is a sacred mountain, but here's where the name comes from. This is the goddess of the mountain, and her name, well, this is the Tibetan name, Jomo Langma, and it's actually short for the name of this goddess. The goddess is Jomo Myolang Sangma. Now, the Tibetan language is monosyllabic like Chinese, which means every syllable is a word, has meaning. So rather than make acronyms the way we do, what they do is they take a long name with a whole bunch of syllables and they contract it into a few of them. So Jomo Myolang Sangma shortens down to Jomo Langma, which is the name of the mountain. She is a goddess, but she's a relatively minor goddess. She's not a supreme, mother of the universe or anything like that. And she belongs to a lower category of Tibetan deities associated with worldly benefits like long life, riches, and so on, not the higher attainments, let's say, of spiritual liberation. So if we go for that, there's another mountain in the Himalayas, or actually the Trans-Himalaya, which is really the most sacred mountain in the world for about 1 billion people, and it represents the next theme, which is the mountain in the center. And this is indeed widespread. This mountain is called Kailas, which you see looking through a ceremonial structure.
Kailas.
Yes, Mount Kailas, or Kang Rinpoche in Tibet. Now, this mountain, what you do is you don't climb it, you walk around it. It's associated with a mythical mountain that stands at the center of the universe in Buddhist, Hindu, and Jain cosmology. This is a mountain called Meru or Sumeru, and it dwarfs Everest. It rises 80,000 yojanas. They're different, at least 80,000 miles high and 80,000 miles deep. And you can see the mountain opening like a flower here with bands of clouds above, and the palace of the king of the gods, Indra, on its summit. And we live on a continent outside a ring of mountains, this continent here called Jambudvipa. So as I say, the ritual for both Hindus and Buddhists is to go to this mountain. Used to be one of the longest and most arduous pilgrimages in the world. And you walk around it. It's about 50 kilometers around. You go over an 18,500 foot pass. And this is a Tibetan woman who's just made the circumambulation. And you can see the joy that going to the center of the universe has brought her. Some people do it the hard way, doing full-length body prostrations the whole way around. Takes about 3 weeks. And others will do it with a minimal amount of equipment, walking barefoot across snow and ice, like this person here. The high point is the Drol Mala, the Pass of the Saviors. And here a Tibetan pilgrim, you can see Tibetan prayer flags. She's leaving a part of herself as sort of an offering, indicating that she's relinquishing attachments to her ego in order to attain enlightenment for the benefit of everyone else. Before I leave Kailas, I should just mention, and I'll talk about it a bit more in the think tank, I got involved in a project in which I was guiding an organization, an intergovernmental organization of scientists from all the Himalayan countries on trying to get the governments of India, Nepal, and China to nominate Mount Kailas and the pilgrimage routes to it as a World Heritage Site, but I won't go into it here. So now we go to the next theme, which is mountain as place of power. This is Taishan in China, and this mountain is connected with the cult of the emperors. When Chinese emperors felt that they had brought their dynasties to the apogee of their power and glory, they would climb Taishan to perform sacrifices to the Jade Emperor in heaven in gratitude. They didn't dare do this if they hadn't done it, because hadn't done all they could, because then they would be struck down by hubris. And the last emperor who had enough confidence in what he'd accomplished did this in the 12th century. So things have been downhill for emperors ever since. And here on the summit of the mountain, you can see this is the North Pole pointing star. And these are members of the People's Liberation Army watching the dawn, along with many other people. Now, mountains are also places of power for their physical power. This is Kilauea, sacred mountain in Hawaii, of course. And here you can see the what's called ocean entry of the lava pouring in. Now, while I was with the Mountain Institute, I started, as Alton said, the Sacred Mountains program. And one of the programs we did was with Hawaii Volcanoes National Park. We came on the scene, and there was a committee of Native Hawaiian elders who advised the park on cultural matters. And they were concerned that the painting of Pele, the volcano goddess, who's very big in Hawaii, in the visitor center was done by an Anglo back in the 20s. And here you can see what it looks like. And it wasn't at all authentic. In fact, her hair is on fire, and she kind of looks like a surfer from California, a blonde surfer from California. So we had money that we'd gotten from the Ford Foundation, so we made it available to the park, and they put out a call for a traditional painting of Pele. Now, they put out a press release, and it went to the two major papers in Honolulu, which did front page articles on it. And the next thing the park knew was that all the art supply stores on the Big Island of Hawaii were sold out of supplies. They were expecting to get a few submissions, and they get inundated by a tsunami of art, over 140 paintings, which they had to process, took them 12 hours a day. And here you can see the blonde. And this is the winner. The Kapuna Committee, the Committee of Native Hawaiian Elders, chose this one for its authenticity, which is now in the visitor center. And then there were at least 60 other paintings, and they did an exhibit of the 60 at the Geology Museum, the Art Museum, and Volcano House, the hotel. And here you can see it, it was called Visions of Pele. And it really galvanized the whole community. So as you can see from this, Kilauea is the abode of Pele, and many sacred mountains are sacred because they're either a deity themselves or they are the abode of a deity. This is a mountain called Nilkant, which rises above the major Hindu pilgrimage site in the Himalayas, a place called Badrinath, and it's the abode of Shiva. And here you see a painting of Shiva with very strong environmental implications. This is Shiva. He's supposed to be sitting on the summit of Mount Kailas, which we saw earlier. And if you'll notice on top of his head, there's a woman's face and water streaming out of her mouth. This is Ganga, the goddess of the Ganges River.
Keep my eye on the chat and keep talking.
Yeah, somebody, oh, okay. All right, so what this is illustrating is a very important myth in Hindu mythology, which is still very much alive today, called the descent of the Ganges. And the story is this: the Ganges was up in heaven, the goddess, and a sage down on earth asked her to come down to fill up the oceans. She didn't want to come down. She was quite comfortable up in heaven. So as an excuse, she said, if I fall, the weight of my waters will shatter the earth. Shiva stepped in and said, you can fall on my head and I'll break your fall. So that's what's happening here. So she falls on his head and then comes out not too far from the monastery, from Badrinath, the site I was talking about. Now, Indian environmentalists have pointed out that this actually corresponds to what happens naturally, because the Hindu texts say that the forests in the Himalaya can be viewed as Shiva's hair. And when Shiva's hair has been cut down, it can no longer break the fall of the waters. The trees are gone, and what you have is devastating landslides and floods. So Indian environmentalists have actually used this myth for environmental purposes. Now, at a mountain, the Mountain Institute organized a meeting in Lima, Peru, and there I was introduced to an Indian scientist whom you don't see in this picture, named Aditya Purohit. Purohit had been working at Badrinath at this site, and with a very interesting project, which was that they were bringing up tree seedlings, blessing them with the holy men who were there, and replanting a sacred forest in order to reforest the area. It was an area 10,000 feet that used to be forested. It had now been sort of basically torn down. All the trees were gone, and they wanted to reestablish the forest. And the head priest there, the Rawal, as he's called, was very interested in this for various reasons. So they organized tree planting ceremonies in which holy men blessed the trees. And then the idea was not only were the trees blessed, but because they were blessed, people would take care of them. That's one of the problems with reforestation in many parts of the world. You plant the trees and then the cows come in, nobody takes care of them, and the forests are lost. So I was invited to come to this ceremony, and I've spoken in a number of groups, but never in such an interesting group. I spoke a bit, but there were scientists speaking, there were priests who spoke. One of the people who was blessing the trees was this man here who is the Naga Baba. He goes around completely naked, has his arm frozen in that position up high, as you see there. And he was the one who blessed the trees. Now, another speaker who came there was the general, the brigadier who was in charge of India's border forces with China along here. And he brought along a band wearing kilts and turbans and playing bagpipes. So it was quite the scene. And then people went out and planted the trees. And in fact, many of the people who were really interested in planting the trees were the village women, both for providing fodder for their cattle and a place for the cattle to sleep, and also just for establishing the beauty of the place. Very important thing here. So now we'll go to another theme, which is very widespread, which is the mountain as either a temple or a place of worship. What you're seeing here is Jerusalem. And what a lot of people don't realize is that in the Bible, the most common way in which the prophets refer to Jerusalem is as either Mount Zion or the mountain of the Lord. And that's because Jerusalem itself is conceived as a conflation of two sacred mountains, Mount Zion and Mount Moriah, where Abraham was supposed to have offered up Isaac. And of course, it's sacred to followers of three different religions, which you can see here, the Al-Aqsa Mosque in the foreground, the Jewish cemetery in the background, and the Christian Mount of Olives, where Jesus was resurrected, in the background. And here at the Western Wall is where Jews come to pray and commune with something. So speaking of the Mountain Institute, I remember I was in West Virginia. I may have been with Alton at the time, and one of the board members of the Mountain Institute said, you know, sacred mountains, that's not something we have here in the United States, maybe American Indians, Tibetans, but we don't worship mountains. And I said, well, we have sacred places here called churches and synagogues. You don't worship the church or the synagogue. You go there to worship or be in communion with something. So in that sense, mountains can be sacred even in monotheistic religions. Speaking of which, we get to a very important sacred mountain for the Eastern Orthodox Christians. This is Mount Athos in northern Greece, and it's viewed as the garden of the Mother of God. This is the theme of the mountain as sort of an earthly paradise or garden. And here you see a painting showing the Virgin Mary, who is the patron saint of Mount Athos. And Athos is a long peninsula with about 20 Byzantine monasteries on it, and then a peak that rises straight out of the Aegean on three sides, 6,000 vertical feet up, Mount Athos. And she's the patron saint, and so it's referred to as the Garden of the Mother of God. And here you can see one of the monasteries. In fact, I spent Easter at this monastery. You can only go there as a pilgrim, and unfortunately, you can only go there if you're a man, which we won't go into here. However, you can see the coastline. It looks almost like Big Sur in California, where I live, except there are these incredible monasteries with incredible works of art. I ran into this monk here. He's an iconographer, a very nice fellow, as you can see. I took his picture and he said, what kind of camera are you using? And I said, an Olympus, appropriate for Greece, don't you think? And he said, yes, I have a Nikon and my name is Father Nikon. So now we'll go to another very widespread theme, which is the mountain as the ancestor or place of the dead. This is Aoraki, also known as Mount Cook, the highest mountain in New Zealand. And most of the mountains in New Zealand are considered to be the petrified bodies of either deities who came down from the heavens or legendary ancestors who came in canoes from the direction of Tahiti. And here you see, for example, Aoraki and his canoe. He's the deity who's enshrined in Aoraki, the mountain named after him. Now, probably one of the most important of these sacred mountains is on the North Island of New Zealand. This is Tongariro, and it's actually a cluster of 3 volcanoes. People in the foreground are in Tongariro proper. Behind her is Ngorohoi. And this is the mountain that's sacred to a tribe called the Ngati Tuwharetoa. In the late 1800s, the paramount chief, whom you see here, was very concerned that British and other colonists were coming in and buying up the lower slopes of the mountain to graze sheep. Now, he derived his sense of identity. Each Maori tribe and sub-tribe has its mountain, which is its prime symbol of identity, and also its source of sacred power, Amana. And he was very concerned that if the mountain was parceled out, it would lose its integrity. He would lose the identity of his tribe and his mana. So he had an advisor who suggested that he make an arrangement of sharing this mountain with the British Crown. And they did that. And then shortly after that, Tongariro was established as a national park. And it was the 4th national park in the world, not only 20 some years after Yellowstone, the first national park was established. Which brings us to the theme of the mountain as a symbol of identity. And probably the prime example of that is Mount Fuji in Japan. There's no mountain that is more closely associated with a people and a culture than Fuji. Its simplicity of its lines and its beauty sort of symbolizes and represents the quest for beauty and simplicity that lies at the heart of so much of Japanese culture and art. This is a painting by Hokusai. And when I was there, one of the Mountain Institute projects we were working on was we were trying to link together major sacred mountains of the world. So 3 of us from the Mountain Institute went to Japan and spent a fair amount of time meeting with everybody who was concerned with the mountain and then climbing it. And this is, these are practitioners of a Japanese mountain climbing religion called Shugendo, which blends Buddhism and Shintoism. It used to be the most important form of village religion in Japan until the Meiji Restoration, when it was banned around 1860. And what they're doing here is he's symbolically cutting the rope to open the climbing season on Mount Fuji. And here, one of our companions from the Fuji-san Club, with whom we climbed the mountain, you can see the shadow of Fuji being projected in the distance. Now, what had happened was the Japanese government wanted to nominate Mount Fuji as a World Heritage Site, and they were told by the IUCN that they would be denied because there was so much pollution high up on the mountain, trash and garbage and human waste and so on. This was a real black eye for the Japanese, and organizations took upon themselves, not from the government, but upon themselves privately, to clean up the mountain. Fuji-san Club was a major part of this. And they finally did get Fuji nominated as a World Heritage Site, but as a cultural site rather than a natural site. They did clean up quite a bit above. The problem now is down in the forests on the lower slopes of Fuji, where the Yakuza, the Japanese mafia, have been dumping all sorts of industrial wastes, which to avoid people having to pay to dispose of it properly. And it's a major problem. Now, Fuji, of course, and this is where Alton came in. Fuji is a big volcano, and so is Mount Rainier. And Mount Rainier has become a symbol of identity for people in the Pacific Northwest. It's the mountain. If you drive around Seattle, you'll see billboards advertising everything from dentists to cars with pictures of Rainier there, for example. The mountain, the Indian name, one of the Indian names is Tahoma or Tacoma. City is named for that. And there's a sister mountain relationship between Fuji and Mount Rainier. And based on that, at the Mountain Institute, we did a project to develop basically teaching modules for Japanese and American schools using the 2 mountains to explore different aspects of the culture and science, history and geography of each of the countries. And Alton was involved in that project. A very important and widespread theme is the mountain as source of water, source of other blessings. What you see here in the picture is the Indus River, one of the main rivers, sacred rivers of India, up on the Tibetan plateau. It has its origin near Mount Kailas. That's one of the reasons why Kailas is such an important sacred mountain. Here in the United States, the San Francisco peaks above Flagstaff near the Grand Canyon are viewed by the Hopi as a source of water, rain-bearing clouds. And so they will do the Kachina dances, for example, to invoke the Kachinas, who are ancestral spirits many of whom dwell on the San Francisco peaks in order to bring the clouds over to the mesas where they live about 80 miles away, so rain will fall and they can grow their crops. Now, other blessings are the blessings of health, for example. So the Navajo, who share this territory with the Hopi, have a very different way of life. They're pastoral people rather than a sedentary agricultural people. And so for them, the mountains are important as sources of medicine and blessing. So here in this sand painting, you see the 4 sacred mountains of the Navajo that surround their country and make it sacred. Each one is portrayed as a hogan, a traditional sacred structure with its sacred being standing on top of it. The gold one is the San Francisco peaks. And here you see a Navajo singer or medicine man drawing one of these holy people from one of the mountains on the sand. And then in the ceremonies to heal people, they will actually put the patient who's sick right on this diagram, and they've sort of become one with it. And what they're trying to do is go back to the primordial time of the beginnings in order to restore a person to a sense of harmony with themselves, with others, and with the environment, because being out of harmony is what causes sickness and illness. And here, for example, from one of these chant ways is a chant about Sacred Mountain. Now I am long life, now happiness, as I have ascended, ascended. Before me it is blessed as I have ascended. Behind me it is blessed as I have ascended. I have ascended, Oye, from Blessing Way. The final theme that we'll look at is the theme of the mountain as a place of inspiration, transformation, renewal. And what you're seeing here is one of the 4 main sacred mountains of China connected with the imperial cult and a place for the Taoists. This is Mount Huashan, probably the most spectacular of the Japanese or the Chinese sacred mountains. There are the huge walls of granite that rise up like the walls of Yosemite, but they culminate in knife-edge ridges. And actually you have to go through these temples in order to go along them. It's become the favorite haunt of Taoists who go up into the mountains as to meditate there as a way of transforming themselves ultimately into the idea of a Taoist immortal or a person of longevity. So the idea of transformation is very important here. Mountains, of course, in Western tradition are very important as places of revelation. The single most important episode in the Bible, in the Old Testament, is the revelation and on Mount Sinai, of course, when Moses brings the people out of Egypt. And here you see a psalter where you see Moses in the upper part is receiving the commandment at the burning bush, which is the foot of Mount Sinai. And then in the lower frame, he's receiving the 10 commandments, the basis of law and ethics in much of Western society, on the mountain itself. One of the oldest Christian monasteries in the world is at the foot of the mountain that many people consider to be Mount Sinai. It's very unclear from the Bible where Mount Sinai was, if it actually existed. This is a mountain called Jebel Musa, the mountain of Moses, and this is the monastery of St. Catherine. Originally, Desert Fathers came to meditate here around the 2nd or 3rd century AD, and then around the 6th century, they asked the Emperor of Byzantium to build them this fortified monastery because they were being attacked by marauding Bedouins and others. So the monastery is on the traditional site of the burning bush over in the left. And when we went to the monastery, it was toward the end of the 1980s. Israel gave the Sinai, including St. Catherine and Jebel Musa, back to the Egyptian government. The Egyptian government then announced plans to build a cable car up to the summit of Mount Sinai and to put a casino on the top. This provoked outrage throughout the world. Time magazine wrote a really scathing piece saying now you're going to have people, angels going up and down in cable cars. And it basically shamed the Egyptian government out of doing it. Now, when we went and visited the monastery, which is Greek Orthodox, we talked with the abbot whom you see here, and he pointed out there was an example of culturally appropriate tourist development because down the valley, they had built a hotel for visitors on the site of the making of the golden calf. So that's more appropriate. Now, in Chinese art, probably the most sophisticated genre of landscape painting in the world is Chinese and Japanese. This is one of the great masterworks of Chinese art. It's by Guoxi from the Song Dynasty around the 12th century. And this is what he wrote about the importance of mountains. The confines of human habitation are what human nature habitually abhors, while on the contrary, haze, mist, and the haunting spirits of the mountains are what human nature seeks and yet can rarely find. And in fact, landscape paintings like this were a way to help you find and seek them in your own home, in addition to going to the mountains if you couldn't go there. But you can see again how mountains have inspired some of the greatest works of art in both East and West. And of course, mountains have played a very important role as sacred places in the origins of the environmental movement, in particular in the writings of people like John Muir. This is a picture of Yosemite, and he wrote, "Climb the mountains and get their good tidings. Nature's peace will flow into you as sunshine blows into trees. The winds will blow their own freshness into you, and the storms their energy, while cares will drop off like autumn leaves." It's this sort of sentiment. Basically, it was a driving force in the origins of the environmental movement here, because for people like Thoreau and also Emerson and Muir, mountains were a place you could go to for spiritual renewal, mountains and wilderness. And that's a major role of sacred mountains traditionally around the world. Because of that, we started a program, Sacred Mountains program at the Mountain Institute, working with national parks to develop interpretive materials based on the evocative, cultural, spiritual, and aesthetic meanings and associations of different features of nature, especially in mountain environments. So for example, we worked with Great Smoky Mountains on this landscape painting, landscape photograph of Great Smoky Mountains. It was actually an exhibit that we did on the mountainous national parks. And each one had a description of the park and then an evocative quote about that park. For Great Smoky Mountains, the quote was from Jerry Wolf, a Cherokee elder. "The Great Smoky Mountains are a sanctuary for the Cherokee people. We have always believed that mountains and streams provide all that we need for survival. We hold these mountains sacred, believing that the Cherokees were chosen to take care of the mountains as the mountains take care of us." You can see this mutual environmental message of the dependency and back and forth the mutuality of this. This is Jerry Wolf, and we were walking along a river trail. It's called the Oconaluftee River Trail that goes from the edge of the park on the North Carolina side into the town of Cherokee in the Qualla boundary, which is the Cherokee Reservation. The Cherokee walked this trail, and what he was pointing out was features of nature along the way. And the Mountain Institute brought together the park and the Cherokee to develop a series of wayside signs that would link natural features with Cherokee stories and traditions, generally of a spiritual or cultural nature. So for example, Jerry is pointing out some buzzards that are flying here, actually vultures. And there's a very important Cherokee myth about the origins of the area, which is that originally the world, especially in this part of the world, it was very muddy and soft. People couldn't stand on it. So the great buzzard was sent out to dry off the earth so people could stand on it. And where his wingtips went down, the valley created valleys. Where the wingtips went up, created mountains. And that's why the Cherokee land is so mountainous. So each sign is like this. On the left is the story or the tradition, generally in the words of a storyteller or elder, a painting by a Cherokee artist illustrating it. And then on the right, the same thing in the Cherokee syllabary language. The Cherokee walk along this trail with their kids, so it's a way to reinforce the teaching of the Cherokee language and its importance, carrying it on. So it was something that was a mutual benefit for both the tribe, for the Cherokee, and for the park. And here you can see another sign right along the Oconaluftee River, and some colleagues from the Mountain Institute looking at it. So the last one I'm going to show you is one we did at North Cascades National Park above Seattle. And this is a sign where you go in to get permits for backcountry hiking and climbing. And it's basically, the message is leave no trace, be responsible about your waste. But in order to inspire that, we added, or the park added with our help, some quotes and pictures, which you see up here. So I'll go in closely. On the left is a quote from Isabella Bird, who was a woman in a Victorian woman from the 19th century who climbed Long's Peak in Colorado. And this is what she wrote about being on the summit. I was uplifted above a world of love, hate, and storms of passion, for I was calm amidst the eternal silences, bathing in the living blue, for peace rested that one bright day on the mountaintop. And then the message, along with a quote from the Dalai Lama, is this, and the park came up with this message. From Aconcagua to Kilimanjaro, from the Cascades to the Himalayas, people are drawn inexorably to the mountains. Mountain ecosystems serve as storehouses of biodiversity, cultural heritage, and precious resources, including the opportunity for personal challenge, solitude, and reflection. When you climb in the Cascades, you are part of a global community of mountain dwellers and stewards. So finally, the last part I'm going to show is on the impacts on climate change. I was climbing in 1963 and climbed this peak, Ilinisa Sur, which is over 17,000 feet. And you can see it's fairly heavily glaciated, even though close to the equator. And this is what the summit looked like, with cornices and ice things. I came back in 2003, and this is what the mountain looked like. Almost all the glaciers were gone. You can see very clearly on the equator and in mountains in particular, the impacts of climate change. Now, there's a mountain north of Quito called Cotacachi, a bit over 16,000 feet. And these are lithographs, images of Cotacachi from 1892 up through 1913. And you can see there's a glacier on the summit. Well, today that glacier is completely gone. This is what the mountain looks like now. It's a sacred mountain for the people who live along its slopes, and they're very concerned about it because they think that Mama Cotacachi, the goddess, the deity of the mountain, is angry at people, and basically the lack of snow is indicating that things are really going very badly, and they've hired shamans to conduct rituals to appease her and to try to do something about it. Well, speaking of shamans or curanderos, these are a couple of curanderos from Cusco, the Cusco area in Peru. And the one on the left is probably an Alta Misayoc. This is the highest category of curandero or traditional healer. The way these traditional healers get their power to diagnose and heal is through their relationship to mountain deities called apus of particular mountains. And the highest category, the reason, the way they're selected is that they're struck by lightning from the apu up on a ridge. The first bolt is supposed to kill them. The second bolt, which comes immediately, revives them. Certainly much more difficult to become a traditional healer there than to become a doctor going through an internship here in the United States. Not far from Cusco, there is the Star of Snow Coyoriti festival that happens every summer. And part of the ritual is these people called the Bear People go up on a glacier connected to a sacred mountain called Ausangate to bring down pieces of ice for medicinal and sacred purposes. Lately, because of global warming, they've stopped doing it because they're afraid that this may impact the glaciers. They see them receding, and they feel that if the glaciers are gone, that will signal the end of the world. Now, this is the cover of my book, a little pitch here. This is the second edition of Sacred Mountains of the World. And the reason I showed this, and it's also inspired by what Alton mentioned, a comment from him. This is a picture I took of Mount Everest from the Tibetan side, from the monastery of Rongbuk. The monastery is at 16,500 feet. That's 2,000 feet higher than Mount Whitney, the highest mountain here in California. And you can see there's a fair amount of snow. This picture was in 1983. And here is a picture of Everest from 2016. And you can see how much more bare rock there is, even with, there's a bit less snow on the right-hand side, but you can see if you look closely that a number of the snow patches and glaciers have actually receded. On the other side of the mountain, coming off of Lhotse, there's a glacier which has melted back. When I was first there in the 60s, there was a little puddle. Now there's a lake, a glacial lake that's maybe a mile or two long. It's held in place by a loose moraine of rocks. As Alton has probably mentioned in his course, this is not one of the most dangerous of the lakes because of the way the moraines are there, but it's of great concern to the Sherpas because there are a number of villages downstream. And if the lake lets loose, and there have these glacial outbursts, floods have happened quite a bit, the whole villages get wiped out. In fact, they went up, the government went up there and put in a sort of a canal to drain the lake to try to improve what's going on. Now, down from the lake is the monastery of Tengboche, and the abbot of the monastery with whom I walked to Kathmandu many years ago was very concerned about this, and he felt that climate change was being caused because of the deterioration of the practice of religion, and his way to deal with climate change was to make what are called bumpas, little ceremonial vases like this, which he gave to Sherpas to put in critical parts of the environment, most notably on the summit of Everest and up near this lake. And he attributed the lakes basically with withdrawing or shrinking a bit to his having put the thing there. Now, he gave me one of these to bring back to California, plant here. So when I got to the Kathmandu airport, as I was going through security, the guy looked at it and he said, "What's inside?" And I said, "I don't know." And he said, "Open it up." And I said, "I can't. It's a Dharma. It's a religious object. It won't work." And he said, "You have to open it up." So I said, "Can I talk to your supervisor?" And the supervisor said, "Sure." So the supervisor came over, same thing. So out of desperation, I said, "Look, you know, Appa Sherpa was a national hero in Nepal. He climbed Everest 19 times, more than anyone else alive." I said, "He took one of these to the summit of Everest." And the guy looked at me and he said, "Are you a mountain climber?" And I said, "Yes." I'm sort of a has-been, but I said, "Yes." And he said, "Okay, you can go through." So I took it through, got to California, and there was a Tibetan Lama who worked with me on my first book, who lives in Kensington. This is Lama Kunga here. He was into making these vases for other purposes, but he knew what to do with it. So he and my son David and I went up to Tilden Park above Berkeley, very surreptitiously with a shovel, because you're not supposed to be digging holes in the park. And we dug a hole and put the thing in there. He did a ritual. And here are the three desperados after having done our bit for climate change. Now, on a more serious note, this is one of the most sacred mountains in India. It's called Nanda Devi. It's one of the sources of the Ganges River. And the Ganges, of course, is the most sacred river in the world for hundreds and hundreds of millions of Hindus. And not too far from Nanda Devi is Gaumukh, the cow's mouth. This is the glacier out of which the official source of the Ganges comes. And this glacier has been retreating. And Indian environmentalists have noted that this threatens the source of the Ganges, you know, the most sacred river for, you know, hundreds of millions of Hindus. And they were trying to use this as a way of putting pressure on the Indian government to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Now, religious arguments like this, and especially in a country like India, could have major impact and actually do something about climate change. And of course, this is the most sacred city in India, which is Varanasi or Benares, and it's sacred because it's on the banks of the Ganges here, which is seen as threatened for many different reasons. So finally, just a couple of last pictures give a sense of mountains in the sense of the sacred. This is Machu Picchu with morning mist flowing over it. And then Sinyolchu, a peak on the way to Kanchenjunga, which Alton is going to. This was considered by the British the most beautiful mountain in the world back in the 20s or 30s. It's still a beautiful mountain, and it's a large part of what makes mountains so impressive, so spectacular, so inspirational, and so sacred. Thanks very much.
Okay, Ed, thank you very much. That was an outstanding presentation. It's just as good as I remember it years ago. It's probably even better than I remember it. So thank you very much. So we do have time for some questions. If anybody has a question, let me see if I can see you again. Okay. Well, I have one. I'll go ahead and start. And that is, Ed, like you say, for hundreds of years, for thousands of years, people all over the world have looked up at these mountains that they consider to be sacred. And these mountains have been clad in glaciers and ice and snow for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And then suddenly, in our lifetime, we see that snow and those glaciers disappear, okay, right before our very eyes. I don't think any generation of people have ever witnessed anything such as this. What impact might this be having on people's perceptions of sacred mountains around the world? A big impact, no impact? What do you think?
Well, it has impacts in all sorts of ways. I mean, you saw an example of that, Cotocachi. I mean, for example, the people of the area, for whom the mountain is sacred, they do paintings of the mountain, but they still have it white because the whiteness is associated with the sacredness. And when the glaciers and the permanent snow cover vanish, the mountains turn black and brown, and they lose their sanctity. So that becomes incredibly important. In a lot of areas, mountains, for example, we have a colleague at the Mountain Institute, Johan Reinhardt. Johan and I went for the National Geographic, basically we went and explored the links between sacred mountains and ancient Greek mythology and archaeology in Greece. Johan does a lot of research at high altitude sites, and especially in northern Chile, southern Peru, and Bolivia. These are mountains and desert areas near, for example, the Atacama Desert, which is the driest desert in the world outside of Antarctica. And people literally depend on the glaciers for their water and their life. So what people are seeing, I mean, it's a combination of sacredness and actual livelihood and substance. As the mountains and the glaciers dwindle, their way of life is imperiled. In fact, they won't be able to survive because the glaciers are acting as dams holding water, and they're not going to hold water any longer. What you've got to realize is we tend to look at water as sort of a commodity that we use, but water has a lot of sacred associations. And Johan, for example, he thinks every sacred mountain is sacred because it's a source of water, and that source of water is being imperiled around the world. I think there are many other reasons why, but certainly you can see that it's happening there. And of course, as you well know, aside from the sacredness of mountains, over half of the world's population depend on mountains for water because that's where the water comes from. I live in California, and I was just up in the Sierra Nevada at Lake Tahoe, and there should be a lot of snow up there, and there was almost no snow at all. Things are looking very dry. And you've got 40 million people living in California, a lot of whom depend on water that comes from the snow, which is vanishing. And of course, Glacier National Park, there are almost no glaciers left there.
Yeah.
They're gone. So there are a lot of different ways in which, and you saw with the example with Tengboche Rinpoche from Mount Everest, that for him, the fact that the glaciers are retreating, that's a sign that basically people are no longer practicing religion properly, and it's sort of people in the Andes sort of see the disappearance of glaciers and so on as a sign of the end of the world. There's an interesting, I'll just add an interesting little aside on that Johan brought, the Coyoriti festival that I mentioned, where they stopped cutting blocks of ice. They were also encouraged to do that by certain Catholic priests who wanted to purge the Catholicism of pre-Columbian practices like that. So they were using it for their purposes. The other thing you should note is that, and there are an awful lot of sacred mountains that have no glaciers of snow. I mean, for example, Jerusalem's a sacred mountain. Right here in California, there are two sacred mountains I can look out my house and see, or actually I have to go up on the ridge above, but there's Mount Diablo and there's Mount Tamalpais. They don't have any snow cover, but they were very sacred for the Native Americans who live here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great.
And
Any other questions? Huh? Go ahead.
They still are sacred.
Okay.
For these people. Yeah.
Anyone? Because I have questions.
Yeah.
Paul,
I've got a question. I wondered if you'd care to comment on Tibetan burial, the catafalques, and they hack up the bodies, and then the lammergeiers and the Himalayan griffins come in to consume the bodies.
Yeah, what you're calling it's referred to as sky burial.
Yes.
And one of the reasons they do it is because Tibet is basically, most of Tibet is a high altitude desert, very few trees. So generally, Buddhists will, cremate people, but when you're up in Tibet, there's not that much wood for doing it. So that's probably the reason why they do the sky burial. And, they take people, it's actually, they're up on high places. And so they will chop the bodies up and grind them, and then the birds come and take them away. And it's a way of sort of recycling. There's another, the Parsis do something similar with the Towers of Silence, where they put bodies in India. But I think the main reason for doing it is that, it's because there isn't firewood. And also other, sometimes they'll throw bodies into rivers, but that's not so good. It's, there is also, when the Chinese have opened Tibet to tourism, and for a while, I don't know if they're still doing it, but it was sort of really culturally inappropriate, taking tourists up to see the sky burial, sort of a cultural site. It's not something that should be done.
I will say this, both the lammergeier and the Himalayan griffin are magnificent mountain birds. They're part of the spirit of the Himalayas.
Yeah, that's true. And in fact, they're also the geese that fly over the Himalayas on their migration,
Yes.
up to the summit of Everest. They're quite, and in fact, the geese that fly over the Himalayas, they're a symbol of someone who's attained liberation, who's flying, freely through the sky, leaving no trace behind them.
Bar-headed geese. And near Tengboche, there's a forest that's protected by the monastery, a white rhododendron florist. I think that was that youthful picture of you. There were white flowers in that picture.
Yeah,
I think it might have been May. I think it might have been May, and those might have been white rhododendron. And also there's a fabulous pheasant there called the blood pheasant. And I think the national bird of Nepal, also a Himalayan pheasant, the Impayan pheasant, which I think they call it the 12-colored bird, something like that. So there's some great avifauna up in the Himalayas.
Oh, there are. And then, of course, the notorious Goraks, a sort of Himalayan crow, which if you're climbing up high, you have to bury your food catches deeply under the snow, or else they'll get into them and eat your food. And in fact, when we went to Annapurna, somebody had purchased in Pakistan some very expensive hashish, and they put it on a rock on a base camp, and one of these Goraks down, flew off with it. Last seen doing loop-to-loops, I think.
I think that bird holds the altitude record. The British name for it is the yellow-billed chough.
Oh, yeah?
And I believe it's been seen at Everest, pretty darn high up on Everest.
Oh, yeah.
Not at the summit, but pretty high.
Very high, yeah. Yes.
DJ.
There we go.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you, Ed, for that talk. It was really interesting, and the photographs are spectacular. And it just reminds me of, how every time when I go to India, I just long to go to the mountains, and whenever I'm there, I feel so refreshed and rejuvenated. My question has to do with the sort of political significance of mountains. Your sections sort of describe different sort of ways in which the mountains are sacred. And I think in a way they're also politically sacred. I mean, in an obvious sense, they often demarcate boundaries and frontiers. And of course, they almost became a kind of an article of faith for late 19th and mid 19th century, well, more late 19th, early 20th century British geographers and grand strategists, as they were, expressing and conceiving of what was described at the time as the Great Game. But, and they also, because they represented a kind of frontier, and I was wondering if that plays into and sort of feeds the sacredness of mountains in different ways in your thinking. And I would just add in that this is, and I was glad you included the North American context beyond simply the Native American, but also more broadly with respect to the founders of the conservationist movement and Yosemite and all that, Muir and all those guys, because I'm a historian, and one of the great founding documents of the American historical profession was the article, the speech really by Frederick Jackson Turner about the significance of the frontier in American history, American society, as a sort of cauldron of democracy and individualism. And so there's a kind of way in which the mountains and the frontiers represent a place where civil religion is produced. And I wondered if that sort of intersects with any of the thinking that or conceptualizations that might work with your presentation. And thank you again for a really great talk.
Well, thanks for those great observations. Well, first of all, I should say, I only touched very lightly on a whole bunch of different things. I wanted to give a sense of the scope. There's a lot more detail, and I guess tomorrow we can talk a bit more about that in Think Tank. But yeah, you're right. Mountains are very important politically. In fact, there's some scholars, he's passed away, but he was at the University of Chicago, Jonathan Z. Smith. He tried to argue that every sacred place was sacred because of its political power and influence. And he was using as his model for that what he studied, which was Jerusalem. And if you take a look, David chose Mount Zion, this Jebusite city, which is on a mountain, conceived of as a mountain, as the capital, as a way of unifying the northern and southern kingdoms of Judea and Israel. And a similar sort of thing actually happened with Washington, D.C., which was in between the northern and southern colonies, and a way of unifying the new nation. So I indicated a little bit, well, for example, in China, Taishan, which I showed you, has probably the longest record of ascents of any mountain in the world, going back for millennia. And the earliest annals of Chinese history claim that the original emperors, every 5 years, they would go on a ritual tour of inspection, and they would climb a mountain in each of the 4 quarters as a way of establishing their sovereignty over the princes of the realm. And in fact, the most important official in the emperor's court, beneath the emperor, had the title of 4 mountains. So mountains are definitely very much implied there. Politically, you can look at it sacredness, but the 4 sacred mountains of the Navajo, as you say, are sort of the boundaries of the territory in which they live. So yeah, it's a very important. And then one of the things you spoke about the frontier reminded me, Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous "I Have a Dream" speech. Trope that he uses over and over is he talks about mountain places of freedom and liberty, and let freedom bring, and he lists them, the mountains all the way across the country, starting with the mountains there in Georgia, going all the way to California. So mountains are associated, with political ideas of freedom and liberty, which are at the core of American values. And of course, America the Beautiful to him is the Purple Mountains majesty.
So Ed, I've had this question in my class I wanted to ask you, which is, you have the example of the Tengpoche Rinpoche believing that climate change is related to people not being as practicing religion as they used to. I've heard the same thing with lamas in Khumbu and elsewhere, saying that whereas people used to burn incense to the gods, they now burn garbage because tourism has become the driving force, and they're burning garbage to because that's what they do, and they want to make money. And the question is, do religious leaders, what role do they play in both conservation, in addition to planting seedlings, as you said? Do they play a major role in people's behavior in terms of towards the environment, towards behavior that could influence climate change? what role are they playing now in conservation?
Actually, a pretty major role. I mean, for example, the ecumenical patriarch of the Eastern Orthodox Church is very much concerned with the environment and has made that a major part of his mission. You have, I mean, for example, at Tengboche, there you had, the Rawal, the chief priest. One of his concerns and one of his reasons, and there are all sorts of, see, here's the thing. It's very important for the environmental messages to put them in a form that really resonates with people. So if you come into a place like Badrinath, where I showed that picture, and say, you've got to plant trees because we need biodiversity. Doesn't mean much to people, and a lot of people, especially villagers in the culture. But on the other hand, if you say if you plant trees, you're replanting Shiva's hair and you will get blessings from Shiva, that resonates. Mm-hmm. So, there are various reasons for doing it. There's a center it's at Yale of religion and ecology, in which they're looking, you can go to the website, Religion and Ecology, how the leaders and the texts and so on, Buddhism, Hinduism, all the different religions and indigenous traditions are working or trying to do something about the environment. Okay. There's just, as a sort of an interesting aside, sometimes these things happen inadvertently. I mentioned briefly that Mount Athos in Greece was the garden of the Mother of God. Now, I mentioned there that only men are allowed, and this is a source of great controversy because it's a World Heritage Site, which is supposed to be, of ultimate value for all of humanity, and half of humanity is excluded from there. But it's had an interesting environmental consequence because of this religious injunction. It bars not only women, but all females of all species, which means that Mount Athos preserves biodiversity, which is found nowhere else in the Balkans, because they never allowed flocks of goat and sheep to come in and chew up the countryside.
Okay.
I mean, that wasn't intentional. But yeah, right. I mean, the Catholic Church, there are ceremonies where priests are saying, you're going to bless a certain place and keep it protected. And in places like India, there are many sacred groves, many places, and they can be a major source of. Well, you pointed out, I think, the sacred grove near Tengboche. There are a number of these that are established by monasteries, and there's some studies that show those are among the best protected. If there are religious reasons for protecting a place, they're often more sustainable over the long term than governmental administration regulations and so on, which people may or may not observe.
Right. Okay.
But of course, also as the Tengboche Rinpoche was saying, religion for him is dwindling, and of course, a lot of these practices, and there aren't local traditional practices that have protected forests in a lot of places, animals and so on. With modernization and globalization, they either have to adapt to the new ways of the world, or they're losing their power and efficacy.
Right. Okay. Great. Well, I think we're about out of time. I'd like to thank you again, Ed, but I do have one final question, and that is that Stanley Tool Company is based in Connecticut, and they have provided funding for art museums, et cetera, et cetera. So I was looking at the web the other night, and I saw this advertisement of Stanley Tools, and there is Ed Bernbaum hanging from a Stanley screwdriver, which he has used as a piton. And the caption was, Ed Bernbaum trusts Stanley Tools with his life, or something to that effect. What's the story behind that?
Well, I was president of the Harvard Mountaineering Club, and somebody called me up during reading period, January. It was very cold and dark, and he was looking for a Woodrow Wilson Sayre Jr., who was Woodrow Wilson's, I think, grandson or grandnephew, who had tried to, he wrote a very funny book called Four Against Everest, where they sneaked into Tibet when it was closed and tried to climb it.
Yes, I read that.
So he wanted to get a hold of him. And I said, well, you can't find him because he's off to Antarctica, I've heard, trying to beat an official American expedition to make the first ascent of the highest mountain in Antarctica, the Vincent Massif. So he said, well, I was calling him to do a commercial. Would you like to do it? I said, well, why not? So we went out, drove out to Quincy Quarries, south of Boston, where we go rock climbing in the spring. And I took a Stanley screwdriver and I pounded it in and did direct date on it. And the plastic handle broke off. So I just sort of stuck it back on and tied off the metal shaft. And they took the picture. You can stake your life on a Stanley screwdriver. And then we came back to rock climb that spring, and that whole overhang under which I've been doing it had fallen off in the meantime.
Okay. Yeah, BJ.
I think earlier Jack Vetter had his hand up. Jack, did you have a question you wanted to ask?
Nah, you're good. You actually answered it.
Oh, okay, great.
Thanks. I just have a quick question about.
Thanks so much, Ed and Alton, for putting this
We have a
together.
question. Do we have a question somewhere?
No, Jack had his hand up earlier, but it turned out
Someone
his
else.
question had already been
You
answered.
can hear
So I just was,
someone else is speaking.
Someone else is speaking.
oh,
but
I'm
maybe
sorry.
Background. Oh, okay. Okay, very good. Okay, if there are no further questions, I'd once again like to thank Ed for a fantastic presentation. Ed, thank you very much. It's been wonderful.
Thanks.
And also to thank our sponsors today who brought Ed to us. And Ed, we'll see you tomorrow at the think tank.
Great. Okay. It was a pleasure to meet you all.
Okay, thanks very much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Namaste, as I say.
Thank you.
I'll stay on, Ed, if you want to.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to stop the recording.
All right. Good. So you actually came across